Norwich, the fine city. A city with a story that stretches back centuries. Attacked and burned by the Danes in 1004, it rose from the ashes to become, by the time of the Normans and the Domesday Book, one of the largest and most important cities in England. Flourishing through the Middle Ages, when it became rich from wool and cloth, on through less prosperous times, and yet emerging to become a major manufacturing base, the city is now a world-renowned financial, arts and technology centre. For 700 years, running like a thread through the fabric of all that history, there have been the Freemen of Norwich. This is their story. This is part of the ancient city walls. Happily, several pieces of it remain. It has an important part in the emergence of the Freemen of Norwich, but its role is perhaps not what you'd thought. It's usually thought of as a military defence to keep invaders out. But as far as the 13th century Freemen of Norwich were concerned, it had another function, and that was to protect the rights of trade and commerce within the city. If traders from outside the city wanted to come in, they were charged a heavy toll to do so. Let me drop in a very famous name from history, Richard the Lionheart. He comes into the story because around 1194 he needed money to pay for his next costly crusade. He raised it by levying a charge on cities including Norwich. In return, he gave Norwich a charter granting it freedom from tolls throughout England and the right for its citizens to elect their own officers. This was the beginnings of self-government, and the 21st century Freemen of Norwich are directly descended from those citizens who worked to develop that.
I've been a Freeman of Norwich since I was 18 years old. I took up the freedom from my father and he took it up from his father before him. My father is a master butcher in Norwich and his father was a master baker. I haven't followed the trend. I have worked for Aviva for the last 12 years. I'm proud to be a Freeman of Norwich and to be part of the legacy of the Freemen, to be part of the history and the culture that's been woven into the fabric of Norwich. It's a source of pride for me to see how the freedom and how the free men have shaped the city and the contribution that they have given to the city of Norwich.
By 1285, the Freemen had become really rather well organised. Because of their new powers, they'd begun to keep records of their accounts and details of bylaws. I've come to Norfolk Records Office to look at the Book of Customs and the Old Free Book, which dates from 1317. And it contains the very first entries, and here they are. And the first entry, indecipherable to the modern eye, is William Flesh, a butcher. Now what's interesting about these entries is that although we know the Freemen had existed prior to 1317, these now give us a very clear start date in their history, and also we begin to get an insight into what it meant to be a Freeman. Essentially, if you paid your rates and taxes, you were eligible to be a Freeman, and if you wanted to trade within the city walls, then a Freeman you had to be. There were, though, conditions. A man could inherit the role from his father, or he could serve an apprenticeship with a Freeman for 7 years and then pay a fee. Newcomers who'd served apprenticeships elsewhere could buy the role by paying a higher fee. A candidate also had to convince the admissions panel that he could uphold the obligations of being a Freeman, and this included paying his rents and taxes and also renting a furnished house. He would then have to pay a fee of sixpence. Now that's about £40 in today's money, and this was at a time when £1 would support a labourer's lifestyle for a year. Women, it seems, weren't eligible for the role, and yet within these pages we have found names of some women dating back to the 14th century. We believe that some women, widows for example, were allowed to carry on their husbands' businesses without paying a fee, and yet some women had paid a fee. Either way, women's names from as early as the 14th century are rare.
The Norwich Freemen have commissioned a database, an online database, based on the Norwich Freemen registers. But it's during the work we've done on the database that we have found more lady freemen, and they are Anselna, Joan Colwyn, Isabella, and those were 1366, and Anselna was the earliest at 1338. In the 1980s, when there were the first calls to admit women, from people like Valerie Gutzman and Pat Hollis and so on, the Freemen did quite a lot of research on it, and they found that women actually had always been eligible for the freedom by apprenticeship. Now, women freemen are not unique. The City of London has a tradition of entering women as freemen. And York also does, on the basis of their registers. The question is, why so few in Norwich, and why did they disappear?
And it's a point we'll return to.
The Book of Customs laid down regulations about trade. Buying and selling had to take place here in the marketplace, with traders grouped together, fishmongers in one place, drapers in another. And they must have been onto something, because it's pretty much the same today.
These were not altogether easy times. The Black Death had taken a terrible toll on the city in 1349, killing 2/5 of the population. There had been civil unrest too.
But the whole business of, well, business was doing very well. Those city walls were protecting city-based traders' rights, and Norwich prospered. The income funded the construction of several public buildings, including Cow Tower, which would later be sacked in Robert Kett's 16th century rebellion, and then, in 1409, the Guildhall. By then, Norwich's significant powers of self-government included having their own mayor. The first mayor had been appointed in 1404, just before the Guildhall was built. He was William Appleyard, and he was a freeman of Norwich.
As Lord Mayor, we work closely with the Freemans because of the things that the Freemen do and the Lord Mayors do, like the Lord Mayor's procession and providing the chains. We do a lot with the charities. There's a lot that they do, and it goes unnoticed because they don't brag about it. And I think that it's wonderful. It's all for the good of the city. That makes me very proud. And it's really, really continuing this great long association way back to the 12th and 13th century.
This is what makes history so exciting. Over 600 years ago, William Appleyard would have stood exactly where I'm standing now. He would have attended meetings in this place. In fact, from 1412 onwards, enrolments into the Freemen happened here in the Guildhall. So, the Freemen of Norwich were now an established part of the city's social structure, integral to its self-government, effectively controlling trade, and with one of their number as mayor, they and the city were enjoying a time of prosperity. Norwich was booming. Once again, I'm standing in the footsteps of William Appleyard. This is where he lived. Today, it's the Museum of Norwich at the Bridewell, and it's fitting that William Appleyard's home is now a thriving museum of Norwich life.
My name's Phil Arms. I've been a freeman now for something like 40 years, and to be quite honest with you, when I was admitted to the freedom at the tender age of 18, I wasn't really sure what it was all about. It was a family tradition passed down through the family for several generations, and at the time I was actually in the Royal Navy, so I lived away from home for many, many years. Coming back to this fine city, it makes you really understand and appreciate quite what Norwich has and what it's got to offer. One or two of the sort of what we call them anachronistic virtues of the freedom were something that I wasn't too sure about. I don't have much cattle, so I can't really drive that through the streets of Norwich, which I believe I'm entitled to do. And of course we don't hang people anymore, although of course I am allowed to have a silken rope should that, what should we say, punishment befall on my shoulders.
Another important Norwich museum is here at Strangers' Hall. Built largely in the 14th century, it too was the home of mayors of Norwich. Its name is interesting. It's a direct reference to the foreign workers who came to Norwich, the strangers.
Why did they come?
Despite the boom times, recession had hit the cloth-making industry that was so important to Norwich, and it was the freemen who were instrumental in bringing about its recovery. They actively encouraged workers fleeing religious persecution in Europe to settle in the city. Flemish workers in particular came here, so much so that they soon represented almost a third of the city's population, which is interesting in that it makes Norwich one of the first cities in England to experience significant immigration. And with that immigration came renewed prosperity. The Flemish workers brought new textiles, new techniques and new processes, and they rejuvenated the Norwich cloth industry. Those Flemish workers also brought something else, pet canaries. But the rest, as they say, is history.
The freemen played an important part in establishing and displaying the city's traditions. Today's Lord Mayor's procession is a direct link to the Mayor's riding that they organised. The freemen would lead this great procession, followed by the mayor and then the aldermen. They came through these streets with robes and horses, swords and the mace, and they ended up
Here at St Andrew's Hall, where they enjoyed a massive banquet. The freemen's great feast here with musical entertainment cost a lot of money. It far exceeded the civil allowance, so the mayor had to pick up the bill. By the 17th century, Norwich was really thriving again. The cheap, lightweight fabrics produced here had become very popular, and that prosperity fueled more shops, more cultural activities, and new professional services. Norwich had become a very fashionable place to be, and it was second only to London. And yet, for all their contribution to that prosperity, the freemen were beginning to struggle. Why? Because with all that business change going on and the massive expansion, suddenly it didn't seem important anymore to be a freeman. Business practices were changing. Trade was no longer confined to the marketplace. Deals were now done in private, often in inns like the Bell Hotel, and even the tolls to enter the city had stopped. The freemen had really become victims of their own success. Trade was booming and they'd driven that. But because it was so vibrant, commerce didn't seem to need the old rules anymore. But even in this new and exciting economy, some rules hadn't changed, and Norwich would get into trouble for breaking them.
English society was evolving, and life in Norwich and the desire of some to maintain the old ways meant that politics in the city had taken some dangerous twists. Suffice it to say that the conduct of elections was questionable. In 1678, for example, the mayor had tried to swing an election for the Whig party by admitting over 300 men to the Freemen of Norwich and then bribing them with beer to vote for the Whig candidate, the old Cavalier and Royalist Augustine Briggs.
By 1729, such practices had become so rife that Parliament was forced to pass an Act, and I quote, for the better regulation of elections in the city of Norwich. From then on, a freeman would have to be registered for at least a year before he could vote. The changes in the commercial life of Norwich were by now quite significant. The truth is that by the 18th century, the title of Freeman of Norwich had lost its value as a licence to trade and had become simply a permit to vote in elections.
Plus, the cloth industry was waning, and many of the newly impoverished freeman weavers were tempted to sell their vote for £10, which, when you were earning 5 shillings, that's 25p a week, is quite a lot of money.
As the 19th century dawned, life would change even more. The Norwich weaving trade was now in steep decline, and this street, Elm Hill, home to much of it, would fall into decay.
Such were the changes in the city and the fortunes of the freemen that they were now considered unrepresentative of the electorate, and in 1832 the Electoral Reform Act sought to completely abolish the rights and privileges of being a freeman. But time heals all wounds, and Parliament was a bit kinder than had been expected. The House of Lords opposed the abolition of the freedom because they saw it as a link with the past.
There were, however, compromises to be made. The freemen now had new rules imposed on them. You could still be admitted by apprenticeship or from your father, but you could no longer buy your way into being a freeman. However, if you'd become a freeman before 1835, you retained the right to vote for life, but that was a privilege you could no longer pass on to your son. And 1835 brought another change that would have an effect on the then uncertain future of the freemen of Norwich. The Municipal Corporations Act stated that the freemen could enjoy the benefits of borough land provided they could prove possession. There would be more legal wrangling, but the freemen of Norwich were about to enter another era, an era that would see them emerge as a defining body in the life of modern Norwich. They now had control of the substantial town close estate. So my next stop is Newmarket Road.